Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the politics that shape domestic violence policy in Israel. This event is brought to you by the YNS Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA and is co-sponsored by the UCLA Department of Sociology. I'm Dov Waxman, the director of the Nazarian Center and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Tamar Hoffman, who is currently a visiting scholar at the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. She was previously a postdoctoral research scholar at the Sociology Department at UC Berkeley. Dr. Hoffman received her PhD in political science with a specialization in human rights from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She's been awarded, among other honors, the Rothschild Postdoctoral Fellowship by the Yad HaNadiv Foundation, the Postdoctoral Award for Excellent Female Researcher by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the Shulamit Aloni Award for Advancing Women in Science by the Israel Ministry of Science, Technology and Space. During Dr. Hoffman's presentation, I encourage you to send in your questions using the Q&A function, and I'll put those questions to her during the question and answer period that follows her presentation. Now, without any further ado, let me welcome Dr. Hoffman. Thank you.
Hello, Dov. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, so thank you for this opportunity. So I'll start off by telling the story of Shira Isakov. On Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year's 2020, Shira Isakov was attemptedly murdered by her husband of 2 years. She was repeatedly struck on her head with a rolling pin and was stabbed for over 20 times. Further horrifying details emerged of this altercation when it was found out that her son, her 2-year-old toddler son, was sitting there and watching, screaming as he was seeing his mom being butchered by his father. Furthermore, Shira's mother was also on the phone, hearing as her daughter begged for her life. Shira was eventually rescued by her neighbors, who courageously were able to ask Aviad Moshe, Shira's ex-husband, to enter the apartment. She was flown by a helicopter to the nearest hospital and was given less than 20% chances to live. She survived the attack and since then had decided to make her story public, earning her a role as a cultural figure for promoting awareness to violence against women and domestic violence in particular in Israel. As Shira's story continued to unravel, new information circulated. Among this type of information was the fact that Shira actually reported her abuse to the police a year prior to this attempted murder, yet was convinced by relatives to withdraw her complaint and reconcile with her husband. These new information actually reignited an ongoing conversation in Israel, which tends to frame the problem of domestic violence and the ineffective treatment of the state of this problem as a problem resulting from lack of awareness and inadequate law enforcement policies. Yet, as compared to other places, for example, to the United States, it's not that clear that there is a lack of awareness in Israel that is much more than in the United States. It could be said that actually in Israel, violence against women and domestic violence is actually much more present in everyday public discourse than it is here. When it comes to the inadequate law enforcement of policies, where there is no doubt that there is inadequate law enforcement among the police, actually a new report published by the Knesset Research Center, the Israel Parliament Research Center, shows that while domestic violence, that among the domestic violence, women murdered from domestic violence in Israel between the years 2018 and 2020, 50% were actually treated by social services, while only 30% had compiled a complaint in the police, which actually demonstrate that the problem of the mistreatment of domestic violence by the Israeli state is much more pervasive than just an inadequate law enforcement policies. And as I will argue in this talk, is resulted through an entrenched institutional arrangement that guide policies in Israel and tend to prefer preserving the unity of the family over the well-being of battered women. To demonstrate my argument, my talk will be structured as follows. I will begin by discussing how domestic violence came to be seen as a problem warranting state response in Israel. I will then move to examine how the Ministry of Welfare became involved in the application and what were the implications of its involvement on the treatment of battered women in Israel. I will then explore the judicial system, and I will focus particularly on the role played by the religious courts in granting women a way out of their abusive relationships. And I will conclude my talk by arguing that so long as the unity of the family remains institutionally prioritized in Israel, even if more policies are introduced, no meaningful reform can be achieved. So how did domestic violence become a problem warranting a state response in Israel? Well, in a similar vein to the way in which it became a problem warranting state response here in the United States and in other countries, awareness to the issue was really promoted mostly by advocacy work that was carried out by the Israeli feminist movement, which was very much influenced by the works that was being done here in the United States and also in Britain. The first shelter was actually established in Haifa in 1977. This was 3 years after the first shelters have been established in the United States and in Britain. And following this shelter, 2 more shelters were established, one in Herzliya and another one in the city of Jerusalem. All of these shelters were established by feminist organizations that had a really strong emphasis on feminist orientation of women empowerment and women liberation. The Ministry of Welfare has actually responded pretty quickly to these demands of the feminist groups that were establishing shelters and started funding these shelters relatively very early on and supporting them. By 1983, the Ministry of Welfare already funded the Ashdod shelter, which was actually a pilot, which is was a cooperation between the ministry and the NGO and Vitso, the NGO. And throughout the 1980s and the 1980s, the Ministry of Welfare advanced its funding for shelters, for new shelters that were operating, and also for new initiatives carried out by the NGOs. The way in which the Ministry of Welfare worked with NGOs until 2002 was really through grant programs that enabled shelters and these initiatives to relatively have a great autonomy in the way in which they wanted to their services to be provided. Yet in 2002, as part of the movement of Israel into more of a market economy, the way in which the Ministry of Welfare fund shelter has been changed into a tender system, where now shelters began working together with the Ministry of Welfare through state contracts. This had a profound effect on the way in which the shelters were organized and operated. Under state contract, basically, state contract meant that now the Ministry of Welfare became the main funder of the shelters. Furthermore, as the Ministry of Welfare, as the Ministry of Welfare now could actually determine the terms of the contract. And this really changed kind of the character in which, and the composition of the shelters in terms of the personnel hired by the shelters, the facility and its organizations, as well as the different programs that the shelters now would offer the women coming in. So to give a more kind of tangible example for this, you can imagine if before that, once it was grants, the management of shelters would have been feminist activist. Once the tender system was introduced, the Ministry of Welfare, for example, could ask that the manager of a shelter would no longer be a feminist activist, but would actually have to be a social worker that has obtained such and such trainings and has such and such qualifications. And this really changed the type of personnel that that was hired in the shelters, and also the focus of the shelters. It really introduced a new therapeutic approach that overrode the feminist orientation that really kind of characterized this shelters from the beginning, which really focused on women's liberation and women empowerment. Now, with this introduction of a therapeutic approach, a new focus of treating really the family as a whole was introduced over really supporting and strengthening the woman as her own individual. The disregard in which the Ministry of Welfare began to have for the ideas of women liberation and women empowerment, and really for the work of the shelters, has been probably most best demonstrated by the 2011 tender controversy. In 2011, what actually happened was that the ministry has really strengthened the qualification guidelines for NGOs and for NGOs in the contracts for winning contracts. What happened was that for operating shelters that were operated by NGOs, that by very renowned NGOs, could not even meet the initial requirements that these tenders had. This, even more striking, was that while these shelters could not win the contract, an organization that was able to win the contract was an organization held by a businessman who had basically no experience and no know-hows about how to treat the problem, this very sensitive and complicated problem of domestic violence. And this really showed how the Ministry of Welfare began to kind of change its view of the problem and really focus more on facility and on providing its own understanding of the problem. The disregard of the Ministry of Welfare to these ideals of women liberation and women empowerment are not only reserved to this change in the tender system, but are also kind of guided by the legal landscape that makes the separation hard to obtain. Here, in order to understand why separation is so hard to obtain, I will kind of raise a question or a riddle, which I would answer myself as, but I would like you to try and consider, what was the offense of the person who was the longest serving prisoner in Israel? And to make this even more of a riddle, I would say that this person, or that the offense did not involve a murder nor an attempted murder, or an attempted murder. Interestingly, the person who until very recently served the longest time in Israeli prison was a man named Yehi Abraham. Yehi Abraham was incarcerated as he would not grant his wife a divorce. He chose to not grant his wife a divorce and stayed in jail for 33 years until his death. To understand really how this is possible, I would like to go into and dive a little bit into the way in which the Israeli legal system is structured when it comes to marital issues. When it comes to marital issues and when it comes to actually personal status law, Israel holds a pluralistic personal status law. This structure actually results from the status quo agreements. It holds basically that marriage and divorce are exclusively handled by religious courts. And basically this means that in Israel, one cannot marry or divorce under civil law. The status quo agreements, which actually made this system come to being, were a result of a compromise that was established in 1947, before the State of Israel was even established. And they were a result of Agudat Israel, which threatened that they would not support the Jewish state and that they would go to the UN Commission and show their opposition to the establishment of the Jewish state. Ben-Gurion was very, very alarmed by this, and in order to present a unified front to the commission, has struck a deal with Agudat Israel, which basically detailed that in Israel, all marital issues would go through the religious courts, through the Jewish religious courts, but through the religious courts. And these have become the status quo agreements. While these are heavily contested, they still play a major political role in Israel in forming coalition governments and have not been able to being toppled. They're still kept held. The religious course, of course, this system is not only does not only apply to the Jewish in Israel, but applies to all the populations, including the Muslim, Christian, and Druze. This means that even if one is completely secular but wants to get divorced, she or he have to go into the religious court of their religious standing and process their divorce through there. What is the meaning of this structure for domestic violence? Well, it has a pretty harsh implications. First of all, religious courts, all the religious courts, the Jewish, the Muslim, the Druze, and the Christian, show a tendency to prefer marital reconciliation over divorce. And this is also in these cases of domestic violence. These courts also show an extreme power imbalance between men and women when it comes to the way in which they handle and process cases. This is particularly true when it comes to divorce. Under the Jewish tradition, when a couple wants to get divorced, one has to obtain a get. A get can only be obtained through a mutual agreement. That means that both spouses have to agree that they are willing to separate. If there is no mutual agreement, a divorce cannot be granted. What is the power imbalance here? Well, while for men usually cannot obtain a divorce if their wife would not agree, under particular circumstances when they are able to obtain what is called a letter signed by 100 rabbis, they are able to marry a second wife despite not being, despite the reluctance of their initial wife to grant them a get. This has been recently on the news, actually, when two public figures, Sofit Grant and Shuli Rand, have married, and Shuli Rand was still married to his former wife, as she did not give him a get, and he was able to provide such a letter and marry her. When it comes to women under Jewish tradition, however, there is no way that a woman can become divorced unless her husband grants her the divorce. While there are in certain cases, including domestic violence, there is a possibility for women there is a possibility that stringent measures will be taken to compel the husband to grant his wife a divorce. If he does not agree, then a divorce would not be granted. Part of the measures that can be taken by rabbis would include incarceration, as was the case I just mentioned of Yehi Abraham, who, due to the fact that he was abusing his wife, was incarcerated in order to try to compel him to give her a get. But that, of course, did not work, and he ended up dying in jail 33 years after. When it comes to Muslims, marriages can be dissolved. This, of course, also shows an imbalance between men and women, where for men, this solution would be much easier. And for women, not only is it much harder to obtain a divorce, marriage can be dissolved, but it will be in a high cost, which could include, among other things, women having to withdraw their custody of their children, to give up the custody of their children, to give up alimony, and make different concessions. When it comes to Christians, and especially Catholics in Israel, there is actually no remedy if they want to get divorced in Israel because of their religion. The only way that they can have their marriage dissolved or annulled is through the Vatican. It cannot happen in Israel. So one can only imagine what are the prospects of a woman, Catholic woman, wanting to divorce her husband. In Eastern Greek Catholicism, there is an ability to dissolve marriage, but they do charge extraordinarily high fees for divorce. This power imbalance that is obviously that is obviously embedded within Israel's legal culture when it comes to marriage and divorce, has been utilized by men to further terrorize women who, to further terrorize their spouses, especially when it comes to domestic violence. Sometime in the early 2000s, Uzi Bar-On, which was a comedian, has actually made a pretty sad joke that really kind of grasps this state of affairs, when he said that if you go out and turn out a cigarette on the road, then the police would come and charge you 250 shekels. But if you put off a cigarette on your wife, they'll only ask you to come and reconcile with her, to do shalom bayit. And this is really the state of affairs within the religious courts. In the religious courts today, if a man asks, even in cases of domestic violence, if a man wants to do shalom bayit, basically this would stall any proceedings that have been for divorce, and of course the courts would prefer that. Men use this form of divorce denial to extort and blackmail their wives to concede more and more to their demands, and give up alimony, give up property, give up different rights that they have in order for them to grant them a divorce. Actually, if I go back even to the case of Shira Isakov that I just started my talk with, despite Aviad Moshe, her ex-husband, trying to attemptedly murder her, he initially would have not given her a divorce. He insisted on not giving her a get, which shows to at what extent this form of terror is actually entrenched within the Israeli system. But probably most sadly, the way in which divorce denial adversely affects women is by the control over the sexuality and reproduction. If I go back to my story on Yehi Abraham, the man who stayed 33 years in jail, when his wife tried to divorce him, she was in her early 20s. One can only imagine that 33 years later, she was already in her mid 50s, and basically was never able to remarry or to have any other children, and so forth. This is especially given the way in which Judaism, but also other religion, extremely sanction the idea of married women having children from another man. Given these considerations, it makes one kind of wonder, in a state where the judicial system handling of marital issues is heavily patriarchal, as I just described, and is very unpredictable in its ability to grant divorce, as is clear by the fact that at least in the Jewish tradition, this is solely dependent on the will of the husband. State services also are inevitably become limited in their capacity to support or encourage women to leave abusive relationship, as it is clear that once this is not necessarily an option, it is hard to convince women to leave abuse. As state-funded services providers now, the NGOs, which were really this radical force, are now also compelled to serve, to offer services that correspond to the reality of the range of possibilities that are offered by the state. This is also true when it comes to other agencies, such as law enforcement. Research in the United States has amply showed the effect of how women that return back to their abusive relationship have on the way in which prosecutors, police officers treat domestic violence seriously. One could only think about what an adverse effect this has when actually it's the state that makes women go back to abusive relationships and does not allow them a path to get out of these abusive relationships. So long as this state of affairs remains, even if reforms are introduced, their ability to transform the state handling of the problem will remain limited at best. The ineffective treatment of domestic violence, I suggest, needs to be recognized as a political problem that stems from the lack of alternatives to the religious courts. This is not a problem of lack of awareness, of public awareness. and it is not a problem of lack of ineffective law enforcement, although ineffective law enforcement is a problem in of its own. The courts and their focus on preserving the unity of the families basically entrapped women in an abusive relationship. And by setting the ideological climate that really kind of relegates the unity of the family over the well-being of the women, and through their control of the legal remedies available for women, they limit the type of viable solution that other state agencies can offer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffman. That was fascinating, if depressing, overview of the very important topic. I want to first of all just pick up on where you ended in terms of the prospects for reform. And it seems that you were suggesting that really there is no reform possible without essentially a much more dramatic change in how personal status matters are managed in Israel. Essentially, a revolution, if you like, really, in terms of personal status, in terms of and overthrowing this status quo agreement, which you mentioned at the beginning is there anything short of that? I mean, since it's unlikely, to say the least, that there's going to be a abolition of the status quo agreements, which have governed personal status for so long, and given the political power of the ultra-Orthodox parties in particular, which would, block that. Are there any hopes for reforms within the systems that could make a difference? I mean, it seems that, the way you've described it, really, that women who are in the abusive relationships are kind of trapped in these ways or forced back into them. Is there a possibility of creating some kind of other mechanism outside of that? Or are there any ideas that you have or others have proposed?
Yes, so this is a great question. So there are different mechanisms and there are different ways in which Israelis try to transform. One of the most interesting ways has been a recent ruling through the civil courts that actually the family law courts are able in Israel not to grant divorce, but to determine some of the agreements that consider, for example, custody or property or other things. Again, these are not the divorce itself. And there has been a ruling that actually ended up using tort law against an husband that practiced divorce denial against his wife, actually urging him to pay her a very huge sum of money for this. So this is one of the ways in which if more and more rulings like this will happen, perhaps divorce denial would become a less of a prevalent practice. So this is a one route that is quite interesting that is taking place now. Another route that is taking place, and it's not only through marriage, is also through that is not only relevant to marriage but also to kashrut lately, is that people start to do their own initiatives. For example, myself, I did not have a religious ceremony in Israel. I went to Prague and had my marriage as a civil marriage. So many Israelis choose to actually have a civil marriage as a kind of form of protest against this. And the same is for kashrut. Kashrut, for kosher, a lot of restaurants stop actually using the rabbinical services and use other there is an idea that perhaps the Rabbanut should in fact should no longer have a sole jurisdiction, and actually there should be more alternatives such as Sohal or others that would facilitate. So the monopoly is also a problem.
I see. So in terms of civil marriage, if a couple marry outside of Israel and have a civil marriage outside of Israel, would that provide the partners with greater protections than inside Israel in the event that they want to get divorced?
So they would still have to go through religious courts, but religious courts tend to regard these type of marriages as less than the real religious marriages, and in that sense, they are more lax about them because they don't value them as much.
I see. So there's an option then for more secular Israelis to go at least outside of Israel and get married outside of Israel. But what are the prospects in terms of? I mean, this is a broader question in terms of civil marriage. I mean, there is, I know, there has been a campaign to try to introduce civil marriage in Israel. Is that campaign, to what extent is that gaining support? And is this issue, as you've outlined it, the question of domestic violence in particular, part of that campaign? I mean, is one of the big arguments that Israelis are hearing in support of civil marriage that, the lack of that option creates also impacts very severely on domestic violence? Is that connection being made?
I think it is being made, but not enough. I think that part of the problem is that the cooptation of the feminist movement through really the Ministry of Welfare's involvement in domestic violence has kind of changed the conversation to really and relegated it to these, to ask for reforms in particular kind of services rather than really challenge this patriarchal structure that is obviously being practiced in Israel. There is a connection, but I definitely think that it could be excavated much more.
So let me ask you in terms of one of the challenges, I think, in terms of, you mentioned that the bigger issue here is not a lack of awareness, and it's not even reporting that the bigger issue is, as you've outlined it, the kind of structural weakness that many women in abusive relationships have in Israel. But in terms of reporting, awareness, and involvement of the police in particular, is there, I mean, within different communities in Israel, I'm thinking here of the ultra-Orthodox in particular, how much knowledge and awareness is there about how serious an issue this is within an insular community like the ultra-Orthodox, which are much more likely, I believe, to go to the rabbi rather than the authorities if there's an issue, or not reported at all? So do we even have a sense of the scale of the problem?
So I think there is, of course, different communities have a different kind of access to state services, and they're hampered not only because of awareness, but also because of trust issues and other issues. And this is true for ultra-Orthodox and also definitely for Palestinian Israelis. But it should be noted that because of these, because there is knowledge of these, there is actually 2 shelters that are for ultra-Orthodox women, operated by Bat Melech NGO, which is an ultra-Orthodox NGO. And there are 2 shelters for Palestinian women operated by Palestinian NGOs, which are very fierce in their criticism and actually are doing, both are doing really amazing advocacy work for these women. But unfortunately, of course, these efforts are limited, and it is a problem. But I think that more of the problem is the kind of institutional structure these women face, where they are much greater for women coming from communities such as the ultra-Orthodox community or the Palestinian community in Israel.
So when we talk about the Palestinian community in Israel, one issue that sometimes is, comes into the media is the issue of honor killings. Right. And do you see this as connected to the issue of domestic violence? I mean, is it part of the same broader problem of violence against women? Or is it a different, are these 2 different issues that really need to be understood as 2 different separate issues that need to be addressed in a different manner?
That is an interesting question. I mean, they are related and they are separated in very ways. Of course, they, in terms of, I think in terms of the, definitely in terms of the feminist critique, they are very related to one another, and they do demonstrate the way in which men feel they have the prerogative to control and dictate women's life. And I think in that sense, they are very much related. In terms of the everyday life and of women, you know what, when I come to think about it, I think they are still very much related, because they still show, the honor killings still show the way in which the family control women life, control their reproduction and sexuality, and are very much associated with basically the way in which domestic violence or intimate partner violence works. But
the two issues in terms of the kind of public debate and public awareness are understood as two separate issues in Israel?
Yes, they are. They are understood as two separate issues in the sense that, well, it's complicated because domestic violence, part of the problem with domestic violence and the way in which the Israeli public perceives domestic violence in Israel is the tendency to view it as a sectional problem. And the sectional problem either that is related to the Palestinian minority in Israel, or the ultra-Orthodox minority, or to some ethnic minorities within Israeli population that are thought to have greater tendency of violence. So I think that this is that honor killings is it is kind of defined as a distinct subcase that is related to violence in it is even called in the news, violence in Arab communities. But I think that in fact it is not a very it's not a very, and it is prevalent around and domestic violence is prevalent in Israel among all social economic levels. It is just that when it comes, and this is true also in the United States and in other places in the world, when it comes to using social services, the people who end up using social services the most are the most marginalized communities. And as such, our knowledge of these communities is the best because they're the ones that we encounter. When it comes to a middle-class woman that is educated, most likely she will not enter a shelter. She will go and if she's probably employed, she will rent a hotel or go back to family, or she will have other options that will prevent her from needing to use the shelters, whereas marginalized communities, that will be their only option. And that's why we know so much about them.
It gives a kind of distorted picture then of the issue, because it seems like this is a problem limited to certain groups, but in actual fact, there's just ones who are more likely to get the state involved in this.
Exactly, that is monitored, yeah.
Yeah, and that I think is very similar in the US as well. Now, you mentioned before about the role of shelters and how the shift in the tender system has changed, who runs shelters and the kinds of services that they provide. Is there also a privatization of it? I mean, are there shelters outside of these state-funded shelters? Is there other options, or is it just really that the state has essentially kind of become the primary provider of shelters and services for victims of domestic violence?
So the state is generally, yes, is generally the largest provider of such services, but NGOs do have their own initiatives, and actually NGOs act as basically service innovators in a way, by actually introducing new mechanisms, new services, and hoping that the Ministry of Welfare will eventually absorb them as well and start funding them so they can kind of, innovate and bring out more services.
But they're still looking for state funding. I mean, there's not really another model that other shelters.
No, there's not, as far as I know, there's not a competing model for, yeah, no.
Do you know, I mean, this is a very general question. It might be impossible to answer, but do you know, since your work is on the comparative, and you focused in your talk on Israel, but you've also compared this to the United States, do we have a sense of how the scale of the problem compares from one place to another? I mean, you know, sometimes there's arguments about the impact of, say, military, conscription in Israel. And, you know, that there's claims that there's more violence on the roads, for example. There's more traffic accidents in Israel, there's more aggressive driving, and people have linked that to, the impact of the conflict or conscription. Comparatively speaking, is the scale of the issue in Israel of a similar scale to the United States or other, countries that at least have some sort of statistics on this problem, or is it perhaps less of a problem in Israel, or more of a problem, or we just simply don't know?
So I think that while the UN, for example, has different statistics which compare rates of domestic violence in different countries around the world, I think it's hard to really grasp from these statistics the extent of domestic violence, because reporting is obviously skewed. And I'm not sure that, for example, Israel keeps Israel the police started compiling statistics in the mid 1990s. The United States started that way before. And also, it depends a lot on how you compile. The definition of domestic violence has changed dramatically throughout the years. And it's not the same in every country. So it is very hard to compare. What I can say, though, about domestic violence and about violence in general in Israel is that one of the interesting insights is that when around 2000s, when there were many bombings in Israel and the use of guns became more prevalent, as there were many more security guards, and that we saw an increase in domestic violence in Israel. And that might be an interesting, lesson to think about here in the United States, where the presence of guns is so readily available, as that did impact domestic violence cases much more. And I think also, but this is again the same in the United States, COVID has impacted cases of domestic violence. Really in a bad way, and numbers, and it became a much more serious problem throughout the COVID-19 epidemic.
I'm curious, you mentioned in passing the definition. This is a very academic question. The definition has changed. How so? I mean, I think we kind of normally, I know the terms have changed, the language has changed, but how's what we think of as domestic violence changed?
So initially, the definition of domestic violence really focused on physical violence. And now we start to consider other forms of violence, such as such as psychological violence, economic violence. So these also impact. Also, what we consider as physical violence also changed. In the 1960s, when the first kind of surveys were administered in the 1970s, it was really kind of the use of gun and the use of weapons. Gradually, new forms entered into this understanding of what it means to have physical violence that would count as domestic violence and so forth. So it actually is compiled of different things that kind of emerged throughout the years.
Has that also shifted in terms of, I know in the United States, there's it's kind of gone from the focus on, espousal violence, domestic violence, to intimate partner violence, that it's not necessarily the person who's, they're not necessarily a married couple, they're not even necessarily living together. Is that shift also taking place in Israel in terms of how this is understood, or who may be involved in perpetrating this kind of abuse?
So I think that in terms of we think about domestic violence, or the way, or if I literally translate the way in which it's called in Israel, which is by the state services, which is violence in the family. This is also kind of more of a political discussion, because actually the adoption of this kind of like family, the violence in the family, actually kind of takes away the emphasis on women, on this being a gendered issue, and brings in, you know, the whole family and different type of relations that are not as much as gendered, or not necessarily gendered. And as such, it's kind of skews the way in which the problem is understood. And it shows the preference of the state, again, in kind of thinking of the problem, not as a gendered problem, but as a problem of the family, of the disruptive family, or the disturbed family. And
it I suppose reinforces this idea that the family is the desirable social unit, right? And policies should focus on the family. I wonder, you know, beyond the issue of shelters and divorce, are there other ways in which are there other measures that are being taken to reduce the problem? I mean, is it in whether it's be it to educational programs in schools, in wider society, you know, therapy, counseling? You mentioned tort law, for example. And I mean, are there other ways to get around the legal system, which seems, as you've described it, to be really a major obstacle?
Yes. So unfortunately, in terms of prevention strategies, there are, every once in a while, there is a public campaigns that are usually funded by NGOs that address the issue. Sometimes there are more initiatives taken by the state, but I would say that in terms of these strategies and also educational remedies, these are not strong policy instruments used by, these are not policy instruments that are strongly used by the state. Most of the policy instruments used in Israel have to do actually with the treatment itself. And the policy instruments include not only treatment of battered women, actually there are some very interesting programs targeted towards battering men, towards perpetrators. These include, and these were developed by NGOs and gradually absorbed by the state, but these include, for example, a hostel for battering husbands, a day center for battering spouses, a hotline, and other remedies that try to actually work with men itself. It actually brings a story that that I don't know if it's actually a true story, but when in the 60s, when the first reported rape happened in Israel, there was a call that all women must hide in their houses and not get out because a rape happened in Israel. And then Golda Meir got really upset, and she said, all the men should be held in their house. The women didn't do anything. It's the men that raped. So really, this is this NGOs are trying to kind of focus also on treating men rather than trying to isolate women and make them start a new life.
I wonder, does it matter, given the role of the Ministry of Welfare in overseeing this, largely overseeing it, does it matter greatly which party controls the Ministry of Welfare? I mean, you know, this has often been under, I think, Shas in the past has been one of the, it's generally been, when they've been in government at least, that's been one of the ministries. And so it's often been ultra-Orthodox parties who have controlled that. Does that make a big difference in any government to how, you know, does it shift greatly depending on which parties in control?
Yes, for example, in the 1990s, when it was led by the Avodah, and Ola Namir was the Minister of Welfare, that is the time where we've seen the most drastic changes in terms of funding funneled towards treating this problem. She had experience in welfare, and particularly she knew the plight of battered women, and she has devoted much of her work as a minister of welfare in those. So definitely there is, and ministers of welfare can affect very much the.
As you look over this, you know, as you presented this, do you see generally the trend line moving in a positive direction over these years from the, you know, the early establishment of these shelters as you presented it to today, where there's an expansion of services, growing awareness, etc., so we can kind of see things moving in a positive? Or is it more, given these shifts of political control, whoever's in charge of the Ministry of Welfare, that, you know, there isn't really the trend isn't really in a positive direction so much as just, you know, one step forward, two steps back, two steps forward, one step back, and just shifting depending upon the vagaries of Israeli politics and who happens to be in control of the ministry, or simply the continued power of this kind of patriarchal thinking in the religious court system? I mean, I guess what I'm asking is there hope? Are we moving in a positive direction?
So I think this is a complicated question, and I think the gradual awareness and also the mounting critique of the religious courts has also kind of made them make some concessions and transform them. They are much more willing to incarcerate men who abuse their wives and to try and use measures due to the high criticism that they're receiving from the Israeli public. So in that sense, we do see that the more demand grows, the more there are changes. But these changes, again, are very slim. I mean, they still are not able to topple this. And one needs to think, what is the ideological climate that is being promoted here, when it is clear, even if any one of you think of yourself as a shelters worker, and you're facing a battered woman where, you know, this is so unpredictable whether or not she will able to. I mean, what kind of things can you offer her when you know that her options are so limited, and you want to help her? So so I think there's great strides and great limitations, and it's hard to really know. Also, the composition in Israel, the demographic composition in Israel is changing, and it's becoming more and more religious. So it's hard to know. So while on the one hand, nowadays feminist critique is much more in the public discourse, and people are much more aware of gender imbalances, we still have the composition changing. So it's.
Okay, well, I think I was hoping for a more optimistic or hopeful ending, but I guess that's not going to be possible. But there is at least some positive steps that are being taken, and I think, as you've mentioned, you know, awareness, the rising awareness of this issue, and the work of scholars such as yourself of you know, putting more scholarly attention, I think, on this is very important as well within Israel and more broadly in terms of our understanding of Israeli society and politics. So I want to thank you, Dr. Hoffman, for sharing your knowledge, and your expertise is really fascinating, and I think an important topic which is often not discussed nearly enough. So thank you for joining us today. I want to thank all of our audience members for joining us today, and a reminder that this webinar will also be available on our website as well as on our YouTube channel. So please share it with friends and colleagues, encourage people to watch it. And I also want to invite you all to join us for our next webinar, which will be taking place on Wednesday, May the 4th, when Dr. Shai Haskani, an assistant professor of history and Jewish studies at the University of Maryland, will discuss his book, Dear Palestine, A Social History of the 1948 War. He'll be joined in conversation with Professor David Myers and Avery Weinman, the graduate fellow at the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you again to Dr. Tamar Hoffman for sharing her expertise with us. Thank you
for having me.
Thanks.